They told you the dead don't fight back, but that was before 1915, before the day men vomited blood, with faces melting off their skulls, their lungs rotting from the inside, and still, they charged out. Imagine this. You're a German soldier. You've just launched a gas attack on a Russian fortress, not with simple tear gas, but with chlorine so dense it burns skin, dissolves organs, and turns lungs into mud. You've watched entire battalions drop from far less. You walk forward, bayonet ready, assuming the ground will be littered with corpses, and then you see them, dozens of soldiers, walking, but these are not men. Not anymore. Their flesh is blackened, their uniforms are shredded. They cough chunks of lung onto the soil, their mouths foaming with blood and bile. They shouldn't be alive. They look like walking skeletons soaked in acid. They can't even scream. Their vocal cords are torn open, but they keep coming, not away from you. At you, they raise their rifles, they fix bayonets, and they charge, not like soldiers, like vengeful ghosts. Your platoon, trained, armed, confident, runs. Some scream, some fall to their knees, some shoot wildly into the smoke, but none of them stay, because in that moment, you've seen something worse than death. You've seen what happens when a man's spirit refuses to die, even when his body already has died. This was Osowiec Fortress, Eastern Front, World War I, and history tried to bury what happened there, because this wasn't just a battle. It was a phenomenon, a crack in the laws of war, biology, and psychology. A moment when fear turned on its master. But this isn't about medals. It's not about nations. It's about a question they never want you to ask. What force moves a dying man to rise and fight, not to survive, but to terrify his killer? Because if you answer that, you begin to uncover something ancient. A hidden code buried in masculinity, a forgotten reservoir of terror and strength, the kind of power modern systems fear because they can't program it, and it didn't. And in 1915, the dead still walk, not in myth, in men like you, waiting to awaken. The only difference is, you've been taught to fear that fire inside you. In Section 2, we begin our descent into that fear. The real reason governments, armies, and systems would rather you stay soft, distracted, and obedient than ever realize the kind of man you could become when pain is no longer something you run from, but ride into war. They trained you to flinch. Not from bullets, not from war, but from your own potential. Because if you knew, really knew, what lives inside you, this world as it stands could not contain you. From the moment you were born, they began the process. Soften him, tame him, pacify, distract, reward obedience, punish instinct. They don't fear your body. They fear your will. That same will that made those men at Osowiec Fortress rise from the dead. Faces shredded by chlorine, lungs hanging in tatters, and yet still charging forward with a roar that had no vocal cords behind it. What is that? That is not just patriotism. That is not adrenaline. That is not orders. That is something far more primal, something forbidden. And when a man connects with that level of will, he becomes ungovernable, which is why they built a system to sever it before it awakens. They gave you screens to keep you entertained. They gave you schools to make you conform. They gave you pills to mute your rage. They gave you food that kills your strength and porn that steals your fire. And then they told you, you're free. Free to do what? Work, sleep, scroll, repeat. But not to awaken, not to access what those men at Osowiec accessed. That ancient fury that refuses surrender, even when the body has already lost. Because here's the truth they won't teach in schools. A man is most dangerous when he has nothing left but purpose. And that's what those Russians had. Not numbers, not weapons, not strength. They had purpose sharpened by death. And that's what you were meant to have too. Before they cut it from you with noise and guilt and comfort, You weren't born to be tame. You were born to be terrible, in the way lions are terrible to gazelles, in the way fire is terrible to lies, in the way truth is terrible to institutions. Built on shadows. They want you docile, they want you safe, they want you comfortable, because a comfortable man doesn't charge through poison. He obeys, he apologizes, he asks permission to be powerful, but not you. Not anymore, because deep down, something is waking, a whisper, a pressure, a hunger that doesn't care about being liked, it cares about becoming real. They told you to be a good man, but what they meant was, be manageable. Hold the door, lower your voice, don't get angry, swallow your instincts, smile even when you're bleeding, because somewhere along the line, the good man stopped being the protector and became the domesticated. Let's not pretend this was accidental. This was engineered. Because when men were wild, when they still walked with the memory of war drums in their veins, they were unpredictable, they were resilient, they were loyal to truth over structure. And that terrified the architects of control. So they rewrote the myth. They took the warrior and called him a threat. They took the hunter and called him toxic. They took the man who questions, the man who fights, the man who says no, and labeled him broken. Then they gave you a new model, the modern man, polite, passive, programmable. They fed it into films, into classrooms, into dating apps. And like a virus, it spread until men began to self-censor their strength. But here's the unspoken truth. The world has never needed safe men. It has only ever been held together by dangerous ones who chose to protect. Think again of Osowiec. Those soldiers had no strategy left, no reinforcements, no masks. Their skin was melting, their insides were turning to liquid. And still, they rose. Not because they were good, but because they were anchored. In duty, in brotherhood, in that ancient masculine code that existed long before governments or creeds. You do not come through my gate and leave standing. That's not goodness, that's resolve. And it's what the modern world has surgically removed from your programming. They replaced it with therapy buzzwords and emasculated morality. They told you your rage was a disease, that your desire to protect was oppressive, that your unwillingness to kneel was outdated. They tried to make you forget that true masculinity is not about destruction, it's about directional power. And they feared that you might remember, because a man who remembers, he becomes like the dead men at Osowiec. Unstoppable. He doesn't need to shout, he doesn't need to beg. He simply decides, and the world bends around that decision. You feel that, don't you? That heat, that pressure, that thing they tried to cage. It's rising now. And when it fully surfaces, you won't be good anymore. You'll be real. You weren't broken. You were broken into. From birth, they mapped you. They watched how you cried, how you reached, how you reacted, and they began the programming. But not like in science fiction. No wires, no machines. It was slower, more elegant. A web of words, rewards, and shame. They didn't need chains. They gave you comfort. They didn't need threats. They gave you guilt. They didn't need cages. They gave you freedom with conditions. And the first condition was simple. Don't make people uncomfortable. So you shrank. When your instincts screamed, you silenced them. When you sensed lies, you smiled instead. When your fire rose, you called it anger issues. This wasn't education. It was taming, because an untamed man, he's not easy to market to. He doesn't buy the latest distraction. He doesn't follow orders unless they ring with truth. That an untamed man doesn't flinch when the world disapproves. He doesn't seek validation, because he's already been forged, and forging is painful. That's what they've stolen from you. You were meant to be tested. By nature, by resistance, by trial, but instead, you were softened by praise and pacified by pressure. They taught you how to survive. but never how to suffer with purpose. They gave you dopamine, but robbed you of discipline. They gave you attention, but withheld initiation. So, now there are millions of men walking the earth with fire in their chests, but no map, no outlet, no rite of passage to turn that fire into force. Until the pain comes. And it always comes. For those Russian soldiers, it was chemical death. Gas so vile it tore them apart from the inside. But that pain became permission to unleash. To rise. To charge. Not because they thought they'd win, but because something ancient inside them remembered. We are not here to survive. We are here to be undeniable. And that is your return point. Your pain, the depression, the anger, the numbness. It's not weakness. It's unlived strength. The pressure isn't a punishment. It's an initiation. Because somewhere deep inside, the real you is still alive, still waiting, still armed. And when he awakens, the systems designed to contain you will have no defense. Because they were built for men who could be manipulated, not men who have seen behind the curtain. You think the system is broken? It's not. It's working exactly as designed. You were trained to believe in order, in fairness, in justice. You were taught that the courts would protect you, that the education system would awaken you, that the government exists to serve you, that the media would inform you. But those weren't truths. They were scripts, carefully written, deeply rehearsed, so that you'd play your role without ever questioning the play itself. But what happens when the mask slips? When you realize the scales of justice were never balanced, that the news was never neutral, that the curriculum was not to educate, but to indoctrinate, that the pain you feel, the ache of aimlessness, the sense that something is terribly wrong, isn't just personal. It's architectural, because from the top down, this world was built to keep real men distracted, discouraged, and divided. Man who questions, label him unstable. The man who resists, call him a threat. The man who remembers his power, call him toxic, dangerous, unhinged. They're not afraid of chaos. They're afraid of order that doesn't answer to them. And you, if you ever aligned your mind, your body, and your spirit, you would become lethal to everything they've built. You wouldn't riot. You wouldn't scream. You would walk out of the game and build something they don't control. And that terrifies them more than war. Because war makes money. But awakened men break the economy of obedience. Think again of Osowiec. The Germans didn't run from rifles. They didn't run from numbers. They ran from the impossible. From men who should not be standing, who looked like corpses, who should have been crying. But instead, were charging. There's nothing more terrifying to the machine than the man who was supposed to stay dead. Refusing. They fear you not when you're strong, but when you are unbroken by what should have broken you. This is why they hide stories like Osowiec. Why it was buried in footnotes, not taught in classrooms. Because it reveals the one truth they can't afford to let you see. You don't need a perfect body. You don't need permission. You don't need to win. You just need to rise anyway. All revolutions begin the same way. Not with crowds, not with chants, not with politicians or armies or elections. They begin with a man alone in a room, in silence, confronting a truth he can no longer deny. That truth is usually simple, but unbearable. No one is coming to save me. That's the moment everything changes. Because when you realize the cavalry isn't coming, you stop waiting. You stop praying for rescue. You stop asking for help from the same hands that built the prison, and you begin to build yourself. This is how every true rebellion starts. Not against governments, but against the part of yourself that believed the lie. And that's exactly what the system fears, not the mob, but the man who becomes his own army. Because here's the secret they buried. You were never meant to outsource your power, not to politicians, not to preachers, not to experts in suits, not to apps or movements or ideologies. You were meant to sharpen your mind like a weapon, to discipline your body like a soldier, and to anchor your soul so deeply that no one, no system, could pull it from you. But the world you live in has done everything it can to undo that design. It doesn't want strong men. It wants safe men, men who sit quietly in traffic, who vote every 4 years and think they've done their part, who rage behind screens but kneel in real life, who confuse scrolling with strategy, who wait for someone else to fix it. But what if that someone else has always been you? That's what the dead men of Osowiec remind us of. They weren't saved. They were poisoned, abandoned, forgotten. They had every reason to stay on the ground and die, but something inside them, something ancient and unbreakable, told them to rise anyway, not because they thought they'd survive, but because they refused to let their enemy walk away unpunished. That kind of will can't be given to you. It has to be chosen, and it starts with one sentence. The sentence that ignites every real transformation. This ends with me. Not tomorrow. Not when it's convenient. Not after the next distraction. Now. Because the moment you decide to stop outsourcing power, you become the most dangerous thing in the world. A man who no longer waits. A man who no longer needs permission to be free. They didn't put you in a cage. They made you build it yourself. Brick by brick. Decision by decision. With the illusion of choice, the illusion of progress, the illusion of freedom. And the blueprint. It's older than most nations. Passed down, refined, repackaged. A system of control not through war, but through agreement. Let me show you how it works. Step 1. Confuse the man. Tell him masculinity is toxic. That leadership is domination. That silence is guilt, and strength is aggression. Make him question his instincts. Make him ashamed of his very nature. Step 2. Divide the man. Split him from his father. Split him from his heritage. Split him from the part of himself that knows how to endure pain, command space, and protect what matters. Make him doubt his brothers. Make him compete for validation instead of building loyalty. Step 3. Distract the man. Give him shiny things, pleasure on demand, dopamine in his pocket, entertainment with no end. Give him sex without intimacy, food without nourishment, life without depth. Step 4. Invert the truth. Make lies look virtuous. Make weakness look compassionate. Reward victimhood. Punish sovereignty. Make him fear being offensive more than being ineffective. Step 5. Sell him the solution. Offer therapy. Offer pharmaceuticals. Offer programs. Offer gurus. Offer everything except initiation. Because the one thing that truly frees a man, the trial, the ordeal, the sacrifice, that can't be bought. It has to be earned. And if he earns it, if he sees through the lies and remembers who he is, the system breaks. Because awakened men don't need the matrix. They don't need the products, the pills, or the praise. They return to the one place the modern world fears most: inner authority. The quiet, terrifying realization that I am enough and I am responsible. This is why they had to bury stories like Osowiec. Because what happened there wasn't just warfare. It was a psychic breach in the illusion. A reminder that even when a man is melting from the inside, even when the system has left him for dead, even when all hope is stripped away, he can still rise, not just physically, but symbolically. He becomes the embodiment of everything the system tried to suppress. And that, brother, is what you're waking up to now. Not motivation, not inspiration, but a summons. The old code is calling. You were never meant to be awake. You were designed to sleep, not just in body, but in spirit, and to ensure it. They built rituals around you, but not the kind you see in temples or churches. These were darker, hidden in plain sight, and they begin early. When you were a boy, they gave you assignments, not missions, grades, not glory, punishments, not pain to overcome, You learned to sit still when you wanted to run, to nod when your chest burned to speak, to seek gold stars, not scars, to obey without understanding why. That wasn't education. It was conditioning. Because an obedient boy becomes a predictable man, and predictable men are easy to place. They used language as the leash. Good boy, smart boy, quiet down, don't question, be nice, be humble, be safe. You weren't being raised. You were being domesticated. And they did it so well that now you hesitate before you act. You second guess your gut. You ask permission from ghosts that no longer hold power over you. The world wasn't shaped by men like that. It was built by men who disobeyed, men who heard the ritual lies and shattered them. The warriors, the prophets, the outlaws, the madmen who refused the mask. But history only gives you the cleaned up versions, sanitized, censored. They don't show you the fire. They don't show you what those men had to become or destroy to break the spell. And that spell, it still binds most men alive today. Not through chains, but through comfort. It's the most dangerous ritual of all. The comfort ritual. It whispers, don't fight, don't stand, don't rise, you'll lose everything. But here's the truth. Every man must lose what was never truly his, to become what he truly is. That's what those soldiers at Osowiec faced. They had nothing left, not even their lungs. But in that emptiness, they found something immortal. Resolve, not for victory, not for survival, but for meaning. They died on their feet because they refused to kneel. And that is the ritual you were never supposed to know existed. The ritual of refusal. It begins when a man says, I do not kneel. Even when his body is broken, even when death is closer than life, even when the world expects surrender, he refuses. And in that moment, he becomes more than a man. He becomes a signal to all others still trapped. Look around you. This world isn't random. It's a language, a system of symbols, architecture, and unconscious signals. Everything has been engineered to speak to your biology, but not to awaken it, to tame it. You think advertisements are just about products? They're about positioning. They show you what a man should be: smiling, soft, agreeable, controlled. You think movies are just stories? They're scripts, teaching you how to behave, how to respond, what to fear, and what to worship. Even cities themselves are designed like circuits, boxed-in structures, sterile lighting, predictable flow, not to elevate the spirit, but to flatten it. They call it civilization, but it's really a container, one that keeps men like you from becoming dangerous. And inside that container, they've hidden triggers. You've felt them. That sudden shame when you speak your mind, that hesitation before standing your ground, that urge to apologize, even when you're right. Those are not feelings. They're codes embedded in culture, trained into your nervous system through repetition and reward. And once the code is written, you don't need chains. You'll police yourself. That is the true genius of the system. It doesn't break men with war or violence anymore. It breaks them with symbolic obedience. It tells them how to sit, how to smile, how to dress, how to think. It gives them digital approval and takes it away the moment they deviate. And so they comply, silently, willingly. But a few men begin to see through it. They notice the patterns, the soft censorship, the invisible punishments, the slow erosion of their edges. And when they do, they begin to ask dangerous questions. Why am I living like this? Who benefits from my silence? Who profits from my obedience? And most importantly, who would I be without these codes? That's the question that changes everything. It's the moment you stop reacting like a product of your environment and start becoming a weapon against it. The men at Osowiec didn't fight because they believed in some noble idea. They fought because something inside them snapped, something that said, I will not let the enemy walk through me like I never mattered. That was their signal. Now it must be yours. So if you feel it, if you've been watching this and something deep inside is rising, then now is your time. Comment below, _I do not kneel. Say it twice, not for the algorithm, but for you. As a signal to the world that one more man has stepped outside the code. Fear was never the enemy. It was the tool, the most efficient form of control the world has ever known. Not chains, not bullets, not even poverty. Fear. But here's what they'll never tell you. It's not your fear. It's theirs. The system fears you, not the soft version of you, not the tamed, polite, digestible you. They fear the man you were before they trained you to flinch, before they buried your instincts under shame, before they coated your hunger with distraction. They fear the man who moves through fear instead of around it. Because here's the secret. Fear isn't a signal to stop. It's the compass pointing to power. That's why they had to rewire you. They couldn't remove your courage, so they rerouted it. You still feel adrenaline, still feel the rush. But now it's wasted. Burned on video games, fake battles, simulated risk. They made you afraid of rejection, afraid of being alone, afraid of failure, afraid of being seen as too much. Because a man who's afraid to be misunderstood will never speak truth, and a man who fears loss will never conquer. So how did the men of Osowiec, lungs shredded, flesh rotting, march into enemy fire with no hesitation? Because in that moment, fear was irrelevant. What they faced, chemical warfare, certain death, was designed to obliterate the will. But instead, it sharpened it. When the worst had already happened, when the air itself turned against them, all that remained was choice. And they chose something unthinkable, to charge through the fear. Not to survive, but to strike back. That's what modern men have forgotten. You don't become fearless by hiding. You become fearless by bleeding and continuing forward. Fear doesn't go away. It gets outgrown. And here's what they'll never print in textbooks. Every great man you've ever admired was terrified. He just didn't let it dictate his path. That's the war you face now, not against armies, but against the reflex inside you that says, wait, stay quiet, play it safe. That voice was installed. It's not you, you are the one who moves toward the flame. The world doesn't need more men who avoid discomfort. It needs men who are willing to die to become whole, like the dead men did in 1915. And now, as you feel your own dead parts stirring back to life, understand this. Fear is not a wall, it's a door. And you've just found the handle. They knew how dangerous you could become, long before algorithms, long before digital surveillance, long before psychology had a name. The architects of old civilizations had one goal: control the men. And you control the world, but they couldn't chain every man. They couldn't fight every uprising. So they developed a system of suppression so subtle, you'd never even know it was there. They didn't just break warriors. They rewrote what it meant to be one. In ancient Rome, the gladiators were worshipped in the arena, but chained in spirit, given fame, not freedom, blood, not brotherhood. They became performers. Slaves mistaken for heroes. And men cheered, not realizing they were watching a ritual of emasculation, not empowerment. In imperial China, young boys were made eunuchs to serve the royal courts, stripped not just of power, but of potential. 1,000 years later, that same ritual is alive, but now it wears a suit. It has a login screen. It whispers, don't offend, don't fight, don't feel. And you obey, thinking you're being civilized. But here's what the elite have always known. If you can suppress a man's ability to protect, you can take everything from him, and he'll thank you for the safety. That's why your ancestors were ritually tested. Initiation wasn't optional. Boys were taken into forests, deserts, mountains, And there, stripped of comfort, fear, and identity, they either emerged as men, or they didn't emerge at all, because the tribe couldn't afford domesticated males. They needed defenders, not dependents. Men who could hunt, fight, bleed, and still carry the fire home. You were meant to go through this. But modern society cut the ritual and kept the leash. You were handed luxuries, but denied legacy. You were given rights, but no rights. Told you were equal, but never told what you were equal to. So you drifted. You felt the pull of something ancient, but had no map to reach it. Until now. Until stories like Osowiec surfaced from the graveyard of censored history. Stories that remind you do not need permission to awaken. You only need a decision, because the suppression wasn't physical, it was mythic. And you were born into a world of false myths, weak gods, and dying codes. Now it's your task to burn them down. Before, men were tamed by time cards and titles. They were forged, not in gyms, not in seminars, not in safe spaces. But in the dark, in the cold, in the blood and silence of ritual. Across continents, across centuries, from the cliffs of Sparta to the frozen forests of Siberia, men were not born. They were made. The Spartans had the agoge, a brutal, relentless training program where boys were taken at 7, starved, beaten, hunted. Not to break them, but to strip away the weak shell society placed around them. They emerged with no softness, only a code. Come back with your shield, or on it, not a suggestion. A standard. In Siberia, the Awenki tribes sent boys into the wilderness alone, armed with nothing but a knife and fire steel. No food, no compass, no comfort. Return, and you were a man. Fail, and no one came looking, because a man who couldn't protect himself couldn't protect the tribe. In West Africa, boys faced initiation under fire, painful rites involving blades, scars, and solitude. Their bodies became maps of memory, of pain endured, silence held, and power earned. These weren't hazing rituals. They were unlocking ceremonies, not to harm the boy, to kill the false version of him, the one still attached to ease, ego, and entitlement. What emerged wasn't a man by age, but a man by trial. Now look around today. Do you see that anywhere? Or do you see grown men trapped in boy psychology, addicted to validation, afraid of confrontation, hollow beneath the surface? Because without ritual, there is no identity. And into that void, the machine installs its own version of manhood. Nice, polite, pliable, profitable. But none of that holds when the real test comes. Not heartbreak, not a failed business, not social rejection. I'm talking about spiritual war, when your soul screams for direction, and everything around you demands that you shut it up. That's where modern men collapse. Not because they're weak, but because they were never initiated. No fire, no silence, no brotherhood forged in the storm. The dead men at Osowiec weren't just soldiers. They were initiates in a rite no school would teach. Their bodies were disintegrating, but their resolve? It was absolute. They weren't fighting for medals. They were making a statement to the world. You may take our breath, but you will never take our decision. That's initiation, and it's not gone. It's waiting. What if your weakness was engineered? What if the emptiness you feel, the hunger for meaning, for fire, for trial, isn't some personal failure, but the result of a calculated removal? You were never meant to wander this earth unsure of who you are. You were meant to be initiated, to be cut open by truth, to face the darkness and walk through it, so that when you returned, you weren't a boy pretending to be a man, but a man who had earned his name. Now ask yourself, why is that missing? Why are boys in modern society coddled until 30, fed dopamine, distraction, and diagnosis, but never tested? Because someone understood something ancient. Uninitiated men are easier to sell to, easier to shame, easier to govern. They feel the fire, but don't know what it means. They chase women, wealth, and applause, hoping one of them will make them feel whole, but none of it ever does. Because wholeness doesn't come from the outside. It comes when a man steps into the abyss, when he stops avoiding pain and walks straight into it. That's what's been stolen, not just rituals, not just history, but your right to rise. Because if a man doesn't suffer by choice, he'll suffer by system. Look around. You'll see the uninitiated everywhere, restless, addicted, bitter, buying courses they never finish, following voices they don't believe in, performing masculinity instead of embodying it. Now ask, who benefits from this? Who profits when millions of men fear confrontation, avoid responsibility, and live in quiet, hollow confusion? The answer is simple. The architects of obedience. They don't want men who stand. They want men who scroll, men who doubt, men who kneel before every new trend, thinking maybe this one will fix the void. But the void was never meant to be filled with noise. It was meant to be faced in silence, alone, in the dark, where your initiation waits. That's what those soldiers at Osowiec found. Not strategy, not technique. Decision. When you've been stripped of identity, ravaged by poison, and you still say, "No, I stand." That is initiation. Not comfort, but clarity. Not safety, but sovereignty. And now it's your turn. Because if you've followed this far, you're no longer a spectator, you're being called. You thought magic was a myth. You thought rituals were just stories from the past, dusty relics of ancient tribes and forgotten cults. But the truth is far more unsettling. The rituals never stopped. They just changed form. Modern institutions, governments, corporations, media, still perform ritual magic every day. Not with robes or daggers, but with symbols, words, and mass attention. You've seen them. Mass events disguised as entertainment, political ceremonies masked as democracy, corporate launches wrapped in mysticism and fire. Do you think it's a coincidence that presidential inaugurations mirror ancient kingly ascensions? That media broadcasts open with sigils, spinning logos, hypnotic tones, commanding voices? These aren't aesthetics. They are rituals designed to capture your attention, direct your energy, and keep you trapped in a cycle of consensual subjugation. Because here's what real magicians always knew. If you can direct a man's focus, you control his world. And every screen, every slogan, every social movement you didn't start is a spell, spoken in corporate boardrooms, amplified through pixels, and accepted by millions without resistance. That's how you know the ritual worked. It doesn't need belief. It only needs your participation. You're not the audience. You're the offering. Now remember the dead men at Osowiec. They had no media, no fanfare, no camera to tell their story. But their act? That was a ritual of defiance, a counterspell. Their very existence, rotting lungs, bleeding mouths but charging forward, became a symbolic rupture in the machine. The Germans fled because they didn't understand what they saw, but deep down, they felt it, a force not bound by flesh or logic, a signal that something ancient had returned. And that's why modern rituals of control must distract you from that kind of force. They must fill your days with noise, your nights with fear, your life with cheap symbolism. So you never remember the real rituals, the kind that tear you open, drown you in silence, and return you as something the system can't use. You were meant to go through that. But instead, you were offered Netflix, TikTok, and antidepressants. That's not magic. That's containment. But now you see it. And when a man sees the ritual, he can either submit to it or replace it. They taught you to fear stillness, not because silence is empty, but because it's where the truth begins to speak. Noise was always the weapon, distraction the leash. Because when a man becomes still, truly still, he stops reacting. And when he stops reacting, he begins to see. That's when the programming cracks. He notices the scripts in every conversation, the agendas behind every headline, the manipulation behind every offer. He sees the loop and steps outside it. That's why the system trains you to chase more, but better, faster, endless scrolling, endless goals, endless opinions. But what it fears most is a man who can sit in silence and hear his own soul, because silence isn't passive. It's provocative. It reveals what you've been avoiding. It shows you the broken places. It whispers, face this or stay a slave. That's why monasteries feared the talkative, why warrior monks meditated before battle, why initiates were thrown into caves, deserts, and oceans. Not to fight enemies, but to confront themselves, because the loudest demons live in quiet rooms, and until you face them, you'll never walk with power. That's what they tried to keep from you. They filled your life with sound to keep you from remembering. Stillness is where men become sovereign. Stillness is where the Osowiec soldiers found something deeper than rage, deeper than pain, deeper than fear. It wasn't noise that carried them through the gas and fire. It was that ancient silence between breaths where a man says, if I must die, then I will die standing. And that kind of silence is louder than any war drum. It's the silence of decision, of initiation, of identity carved in flame. But today, try sitting still for 10 minutes. No music, no screen, no stimulation. You'll see how fast the panic rises, because they've trained you to fear your own mind. But power comes when you reclaim it. Start small. 10 minutes. No distractions. Just breath and bone and blood. Let the ghosts come. Let the voices scream. Let the weakness surface. That's how you clean the temple. That's how you return to command. Stillness is not escape. It's preparation. A still man is a loaded weapon. He sees everything. He reacts to nothing. And when he moves, the world bends. The deepest wound in a man's life is often the one he doesn't speak of, not because he can't, but because the language was never given to him. It's the wound of the unfathered. And I'm not just talking about the man whose father walked out, or the one whose dad died too young. I'm talking about the man who had a father, present in body, absent in initiation. The man whose father was broken, domesticated, tired, unable to pass the flame, because his was extinguished long ago. This is not personal. It's systemic. Because a man who was never shown how to suffer with dignity, how to confront pain without collapsing, how to move through chaos with stillness, is a man who will always seek someone else's permission. And that's exactly what the system needs. The removal of the father wasn't just a byproduct of modernity. It was an agenda, a strike at the root of masculine sovereignty. Think about it. The moment the father is removed, either physically, emotionally, or symbolically, the son becomes vulnerable. To institutions, to media, to peer pressure, to false fathers, voices that promise guidance but deliver obedience. And the boy, desperate to know what a man is, will mimic anything that looks like strength. That's how the weak become loud, how the insecure become aggressive, how the confused become compliant. A man without a father is a man without a compass, and that means he can be steered. The elite know this. That's why rites of passage were systematically erased. Why fathers were told to be more gentle, more passive, more agreeable. Why the state said, we'll teach your sons, we'll raise your sons, we'll protect your sons. But they weren't raising protectors. They were raising products. And so a generation grew up learning how to submit before they ever learned how to stand. You feel this wound, even if you can't name it. That strange emptiness when you're alone. The craving for affirmation that never fills. The questions that echo louder the older you get. Am I enough? Who am I supposed to be? Where do I find the man I was meant to become? These are not weaknesses. They are the call to initiation that was denied, and it's not too late. Because here's the brutal beauty of being unfathered. You become your own fire. You stop waiting. You stop begging. You stop blaming. And you start becoming the man your father couldn't be. That's what the dead men at Osowiec did when leadership failed, when orders collapsed, when breath turned to blood. They led themselves. No approval, no guide, no father. Only the choice to stand anyway. It began earlier than you think, before politics, before heartbreak, before money. The system didn't wait for you to grow. It came for you as a child. The battlefield, a place you were told was safe, noble, necessary. School. But behind the bells and backpacks lurks one of the most effective control systems ever devised. Let's break it down. A child enters full of fire, wild, curious, physical. He learns by touching, breaking, building, running, shouting. But then, sit, be quiet, raise your hand, memorize, obey. He is not taught to think. He is taught to comply. He is not asked, "What do you see?" He is told, "This is the answer." His questions fade. His instincts dull. His spine bends. By the time he reaches adolescence, he has learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Approval is survival. And who gives that approval? Not warriors, not mentors, but bureaucrats. People trained not to awaken power, but to manage obedience. This is not an accident. The modern school system was modeled after the Prussian military system, a structure designed to produce factory workers, soldiers, clerks. Not sovereigns. You were processed, not educated. Tested, not trained. Reviewed, not refined. And worst of all, you were compared. Every grade, every score, every ranking. Comparison became your currency. And so you forgot how to walk your own path. You only learned how to beat the others, even if it meant losing yourself. Now ask, what kind of society benefits from millions of young men who can follow directions perfectly, but no longer trust their own voice? A society that fears independent power, because a man trained to sit still for 12 years will likely sit still for 50 more, even if his soul screams. He'll chase jobs he hates, nod at ideas he despises, say yes when every bone says no. Because long ago, he learned what happens to those who disobey. Isolation, humiliation, punishment. The perfect formula for lifelong submission. But what if you saw it for what it is? What if you looked back, not with shame, but with precision? You weren't stupid, you weren't weak. You were trained, but now the training ends because you see the bars. And once a man sees the bars, the cage cannot hold him. That's what Osowiec taught us. When orders dissolved, when strategy failed, those men didn't follow a system, they followed resolve. They moved not because they were told, but because they chose. Your emotions were never yours alone. You were taught to feel on command, to crave what they sell, to fear what they frame, to desire what keeps you distracted. This is not accidental. This is corporate psychology, a system that studies not how to serve you, but how to steer you. In the early 20th century, a man named Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered a new form of control. He called it public relations, but make no mistake, it was mass mind control. Bernays took the inner mechanics of human emotion, fear, guilt, vanity, lust, and turned them into tools for corporations. His first major project? Convincing women to smoke cigarettes. Not by selling the product, but by linking it to freedom. They weren't selling nicotine. They were selling identity. And it worked. From there, every corporation followed. Create the emotional hook. Attach it to your product. Reward the behavior. Repeat until the behavior is autonomous. This is how you became a reaction machine, scrolling endlessly, clicking impulsively, buying compulsively, not because you want to, But because you've been trained to associate purchase with relief, dopamine with validation, discomfort with defectiveness, the result? A generation of men who no longer trust their own state, a flicker of anxiety, and they reach for distraction. A flash of sadness, and they numb. A moment of discomfort, and they submit. Because the system knows, a man who cannot sit with his emotions will always be a slave to them. But there's more. These corporations don't just manipulate what you feel. They monitor when you feel, how long you feel, every scroll, every pause, every micro-expression captured and fed back into the algorithm. Why? To build a better map, a map of you. So the next ad hits harder, the next notification feels more urgent, the next offer sounds like it came from inside your mind. Because in a way, it did. And so the cage gets smarter, more invisible, more efficient. But here's what they fear. A man who knows how to feel fully and still act deliberately. A man who can sit in anger without exploding, sit in sorrow without breaking, sit in temptation without moving. Because that man is no longer programmable. He's sovereign. That's the quiet revolution they can't stop. Not riots, not hashtags, but men sitting still, feeling everything, and choosing what they serve. That's what Osowiec whispered to us from beyond the grave. Even when our bodies were dissolving, we chose to walk forward. That's the power of internal command. They didn't stop at your thoughts. They followed you into your dreams. You think sleep is safe? That the war ends when your eyes close? It doesn't. The war moves deeper into the sacred, into the place where your soul speaks in symbols. Dreams were once considered divine, messages from ancestors, visions from gods, blueprints for kings. But today, they've become a dumping ground for distraction, a byproduct of overstimulation. No longer a temple, just a screen behind your eyelids. But here's the truth. Dreams are programmable, not in theory. In practice, modern psychology has known this for decades. And the institutions that control your waking life want access to the rest. Think about it. You go to sleep with your phone next to your head. You fall unconscious listening to algorithms. You binge shows laced with trauma, chaos, fear. Then wonder why your sleep is restless, why your dreams feel like war zones. This isn't coincidence. It's architecture. You're being denied your final sanctuary. Because a man who dreams for himself can never be fully controlled. But a man whose dreams are injected is a man who wakes up tired, foggy, submissive, and doesn't know why. There's more. The symbols you're shown by day become the archetypes that haunt your night. Corporate mascots, celebrity idols, fashion icons, false gods of consumerism. These aren't just characters. They are synthetic archetypes, replicas of ancient spiritual figures, stripped of power, repackaged as products. The hero, the lover, the warrior, the sage. You were meant to meet them within yourself. Instead, you consume them, worship them, imitate them. And slowly, your dreamscape becomes their domain. The machine has entered the subconscious realm, not just through media, but through sound frequencies, light pulses, neuromarketing. There are patents, real ones, on technologies designed to alter brainwave states during sleep. Why? Because if they can hack your dreams, they don't need to fight for your waking loyalty. You'll wake up already aligned, already softened, already prepared to obey. But you can break this. And once you do, you reclaim the forgotten fire. Because dreams are not fluff. They're training grounds. Visions. Warnings. Initiations. The dead men of Osowiec? Do you think they dreamed of comfort? No. They carried the memory of ancestral resolve. Dreams of blood, steel, and decision. Not fear. And when the poison came, they remembered. That's what your dreams can do. If you cleanse them, if you guard them, if you enter them like a warrior enters battle. The moment they took your myths, they took your map. You didn't just lose stories. You lost a way of seeing. Your ancestors lived by legend, not fantasy. Function.myths weren't entertainment. They were weapons, tools to forge courage, caution, and code. They didn't need therapy. They had the warrior who returned from the underworld. They didn't need motivation. They had the king who fell, bled, and rose again. Myths taught men who they were, and more importantly, who they could become. But something changed, a quiet death. Not of story, but of meaning. They told you myths were for children, that gods were fiction, that archetypes were superstition, that dragons weren't real and therefore irrelevant. But here's what they never said. The dragon was never meant to be real. It was meant to be recognized inside you, because myths are mirrors. They reveal the parts of you that logic won't touch, that language can't explain. And when those mirrors were shattered, when Hercules, Odin, Osiris, and Gilgamesh were buried under textbooks, something inside you went missing too. Now look at modern man, drifting, achieving without purpose, fighting without cause, waking each day asking, what now? He doesn't lack strength. He lacks story. He was taught that data replaces wisdom, that productivity replaces initiation, that science replaces soul, and so he becomes useful, but never whole. Because when a man cannot locate himself inside a myth, he becomes a pawn in someone else's. That's the danger. Without myth, you will adopt the machine's narrative. You'll believe your life is measured in clicks, that your value is economic, that your destiny is retirement, and they will reward you for believing that. They will decorate your cage. They will call you modern, evolved, successful. But inside, you'll feel it, the ancient silence, the ache that no achievement touches, the dream you can't name but can't ignore. That's not depression. That's the death cry of myth. And now it's your task to resurrect it. Not by reading stories, but by becoming one. You are the man in exile, the man who must go underground, face the beast, steal fire, and return with flame in hand. The men at Osowiec did not become legends after death. They invoked myth before it. They moved like warriors of old, in silence, in agony, in defiance, and walked through poison as if it were smoke, because some part of them still remembered, and that part still lives in you. While your myths were burned, buried, and mocked, theirs were guarded. The elite never stopped using legend. They just hid it from you. Behind closed doors, in oak-lined lodges and candlelit halls, they whisper ancient names, recite ancient rites, mark their flesh with symbols older than your country, because they know something they never taught you. Power flows through story. Story builds identity, and identity is everything. That's why kings traced their bloodlines to gods. Why empires were built on prophecy. Why secret orders still operate in silence, bound not by law, but by mythic loyalty. Look at their architecture, obelisks, eyes, suns, serpents. These aren't decorations. They are sigils, anchors of an inner world made external. They believe in lineage. They believe in fate. They believe in ritualized hierarchy that spans centuries. But you were told everything is random, that life is chaotic, that your story ends when the job ends, that your name dies with your body. Why? Because a man who believes he has no legend will serve the legend of another. And this is the hidden war. You were stripped of your story, so you'd never become a threat. Because a man who carries a myth in his chest doesn't kneel to trends. He doesn't flinch at fear. He doesn't beg for meaning. He creates it. Now ask, why are secret societies built around myth, while modern society is built to erase it? Because the elite understood. Narrative is the architecture of control. They write your heroes. They write your villains. They write your fears. They write your future. Not with force, with storyline. And every time you consume their version of manhood, you drift further from your own. You become a mirror for their power, instead of a fire for your own. But here's the rupture. You've seen through it now. You can feel the lie. Not intellectually, viscerally. The unease that follows every news cycle. The hollowness behind every celebrity truth. The quiet voice whispering, this isn't your story. Because it's not. You're not here to be a footnote. You're here to return the myth. To walk like the old ones. To remember what they erased. To reclaim the symbols that were stolen. Like the men of Osowiec, who, in their final hour, became something timeless. Not soldiers. Not statistics. Legends. You were never broken. You were bewitched. What you call depression. What they call apathy, addiction, numbness. It's not some random malfunction of your brain. It's a spell. Cast long ago. Subtle, surgical, repeating. A spell designed to make you forget what you are. Not just a man, but a force. And the first part of the spell is language. They told you you're mentally ill. They gave you terms: depression, anxiety, disorder, imbalance. Words that explain everything and free you from nothing. They didn't ask why your soul was silent. They asked which pill you wanted. They didn't ask why your life felt meaningless. They blamed it on your brain chemistry. They pathologized your hunger for more, your rage, your confusion, your fire. But what if that fire was sacred? What if your despair isn't a flaw, but a signal? A deep, ancient part of you saying, this is not the world you were born for. This is not the man you were meant to become. And here's what they never want you to realize. Your symptoms are not sickness. They are symptoms of suppression. Because the system cannot function if too many men wake up and say, no more sedation, no more comfort traps, no more performance of happiness while you're dying inside. They need you numb, not dead. Dull, but productive. Tired, but obedient. Because a man who feels fully cannot be used quietly. He begins to ask dangerous questions. He begins to say dangerous words. He begins to move with dangerous calm. And then, he's no longer manageable. He's no longer marketable. He's uncheckable. That's what the dead men of Osowiec carried. Not physical strength. Their lungs were gone. Their flesh rotted. But they walked anyway, because something deeper than flesh had awakened. Something primal, something sovereign, something unbreakable. And that same force waits inside you, right now. Buried under years of sedation, shame, and synthetic joy. The spell only works if you don't name it. But once you do, it begins to crack. And from that crack, something rises. Not comfort, not hope. Purpose. A purpose you didn't ask for. A burden that burns. A path lined with blood, silence, and responsibility. The kind of path modern men were told to avoid. But the only path that restores your name. And if you've followed this descent this far, you've already begun to remember. Now, I want you to burn the spell in public. Comment this phrase twice below. I was never broken. I was built for war. Once. For the algorithm. Once for your initiation. You don't use the platform. The platform uses you. Every swipe. Every like. Every post. It feels like freedom. But it's ritual. You've entered the digital temple. And without even realizing it, you've become the offering. Let's rip off the veil. Social media isn't just technology. It's liturgical infrastructure. It follows ancient religious design. A place of worship, your screen. A congregation, the followers. Sacred text, the algorithm. High priests, influencers. And above all, a God. But not one of love. Not one of justice. No, the God of this temple is data. And data demands sacrifice. Your time, your attention, your emotions. Your privacy. Your pain. You are conditioned to give it freely. Not with force, but with addiction. You don't post because you want to. You post because you fear being invisible, and invisibility is the new death. But where did this begin? With technocrats who studied neuroscience like sorcery. They mapped your dopamine system like priests decoding prophecy. They studied limbic, loops, trigger chains, reinforcement schedules, all to build a temple that feeds on you, because they know the modern man doesn't kneel in cathedrals anymore. He kneels before the feed. And here's the most brutal part. You've already become a digital ghost, not flesh, not will, not voice, but content, replicable, trackable, predictable. They call it engagement. But what they really mean is ownership. Because once your story exists on their server, they don't need you anymore. They have the version of you they can control. But you think you're winning. You think you're building something, and maybe you are. But whose altar are you building it on? Yours or theirs? That's the war now. You're not being destroyed. You're being digitally deified, turned into a product, praised by strangers, but hollow inside. And it works because they've merged the primal with the synthetic, the human need for tribe, the sacred drive for validation, the mythic hunger for purpose, all fed into a machine that sells it back to you in pixels and dopamine bursts. But you feel it, don't you? The emptiness after the post, the come down after the views, the silence after the scroll. It's not real. It's not fire. It's ritual. Without spirit. But the Osowiec men, they didn't need an audience. Their altar was death. Their ritual was defiance. Their God was resolve. And their sacrifice was voluntary. Now the question becomes, will you sacrifice your soul for applause? Or will you reclaim your story and burn the false temple down? They didn't just weaken the man. They isolated him, not with chains, but with convenience, not with force, but with freedom. They told you independence was everything, that asking for help was weakness, that brotherhood was outdated, a relic of tribal times. And you believed it. You moved out, moved on, moved up. And somewhere along the way, you stopped moving together. Now look around. How many men do you truly trust? Not acquaintances, not followers, not drinking buddies. I mean warriors, witnesses, brothers who would hold your corpse above the fire and scream your name into eternity. The answer for most? None. Because the system made sure of that. They knew a single awakened man is dangerous. But a brotherhood of awakened men? That's a revolution. So they fed you the myth of self-sufficiency. Be your own man. Don't need anyone. Stand alone. And while you were chasing independence, they were building alliances, secret orders, technocratic councils, political dynasties. Their loyalty is generational. Yours was replaced by Wi-Fi. So now you live surrounded by people, but you're completely alone. That's not progress. That's by design. Because when a man walks alone for too long, he becomes quiet, not in peace, but in paralysis. He second-guesses his instincts. He doubts his rage. He buries his grief. There's no one to sharpen him, no one to challenge him, no one to call him out or call him up. And the system loves that. Because a man without brothers will turn to screens for belonging. To influencers, to ideologies, to algorithms. And the more he does, the more programmable he becomes. But this is the fracture you remember, even if dimly. Somewhere in your blood is the echo of campfires, war drums, sacred pacts. A time when men knew lone wolves die fast, but tribes conquer empires. That's what Osowiec was. It wasn't just a few soldiers. It was a brotherhood of revenants, men who died together, rose together, and charged as one. They weren't commanded. They were bonded. That's what made them unstoppable. And that's what you must recover. Not friends, not fans, but brothers, men, who will stand with you at the edge of collapse and say, we go through together, or not at all. This isn't about comfort. This is about capacity, because you will face things in this life that you cannot carry alone. And when that day comes, you'll either have a tribe or you'll be torn apart. You weren't just disconnected from others. You were severed from yourself, from your bloodline, from your bone memory, from your origin. They didn't just erase your history. They erased your lineage, the living cord between you and every man who bled before you, and they replaced it with nothing. A birth certificate, a government ID, a bland nationality, a tax code, a job title, but no root, no ancestral name, no war cry. Because if you don't know where you come from, you don't know what you're capable of. You think you're just a man. You forget you're the product of thousands of survivors. Men who crawled through famine, flood, fire, and war so that you could walk. And that makes you dangerous, because a man who remembers his bloodline moves differently. He doesn't waste time. He doesn't play games. He doesn't ask for permission to be exactly what he is. But the system couldn't allow that. So they buried your ancestors in textbooks, sterilized, abstract, forgotten. They removed the rituals that bound you to them. No fire circles, no naming rights, no warrior trials, no sacred feasts. Just holidays, sales, slogans, silence. Because a man without ancestors is a man without accountability. He becomes easily molded, easily moved, easily lost. But here's what they fear most: that you might hear them again, not with your ears, but with your bones. Because ancestral memory doesn't die. It waits. It's in the way your breath changes when you face danger. It's in the dreams you can't explain. It's in the rage you feel when injustice passes unpunished. That's not dysfunction. That's ancestral signal. It says, you were forged for more than this. The men of Osowiec heard it, when their lungs burned with poison, when their bodies betrayed them, when logic said lay down, blood said rise. Not because of orders, but because of inheritance. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were channeling every warrior who ever fell before them, and so they stood, rotting and alive, and became myth. That's what remembering your ancestors does. It gives you back your spine. Because once you carry them inside you, their pain, their glory, their defiance, you stop playing small. You stop living as if this life is a casual event. You begin to move like a man who will one day become an ancestor himself. And that changes everything. They've taken death and sterilized it. Once, death was a threshold, a ritual, a return. Now, it's paperwork, machines, a hospital room full of fluorescent lights, and silence. No chance, no fire, no honor. And this wasn't an accident. It was a systematic erasure, because how a culture treats death reveals everything about what it believes about life. And modern culture believes nothing. You are born in a room of strangers. You die in a room of strangers. And in between, you are trained to fear the only thing you can't escape. But here's the truth. Death was never meant to be feared. It was meant to be faced. Your ancestors knew this. That's why they prepared for it. Not with anxiety, but with ceremony. Because they understood how you die is how you're remembered. And how you're remembered is how the next generation lives. But now, you die alone. You're processed. You're erased. No warrior's farewell, no burial song, no stories shouted to the sky. Just a social media post, a headstone, and a slow forgetting. Because they don't want your death to mean anything. If it means nothing, then your life means nothing. And a man who believes his life has no meaning will serve any system that distracts him from that pain. But the truth is buried deeper, because the way you fear death is the way you've been trained to fear transformation. They made death seem ugly, because they're terrified of what a man becomes when he is no longer afraid of it. A man who accepts death is unstoppable. He doesn't waste time. He doesn't negotiate with lies. He doesn't bow to threats. That's why the men of Osowiec are legend. They were already dying, already bleeding, already rotting, but they walked into gunfire anyway, because they had made peace with death, and in doing so, they became more than men. They became judgment. Their final act was not survival, it was meaning. They didn't live forever, but they'll never be forgotten, because they chose to die as symbols. And now it's your turn to ask, if I died today, would I be remembered as a man who lived fully, or as one who hid behind comfort until the last breath left him? This isn't about morbidity. It's about legacy. Because when you begin to live with death in your awareness, you become ruthless with your time, honest with your actions, and unshakable in your purpose. That you begin to walk like your soul is on fire. They don't just steal your time, they steal your sense of time. You think you understand it. Seconds, minutes, hours, schedules, deadlines, calendars. But this isn't time, it's measurement. A grid, a cage, and you were placed inside it. Without question. But what if I told you, time, as you know it, is artificial. Before the clock, before the factory bell, before 9 to -5, time was cyclical, sacred, aligned with nature, with soul rhythms, not shareholder profits. Our ancestors moved with the moon, not the market. They knew there were seasons for war, seasons for rest, seasons for grief, and seasons for creation. Now, you're expected to be productive 365 days a year. No initiation, no descent, no death. Just endless output. Because the modern clock wasn't made to serve life. It was made to serve the machine. You wake to an alarm, a word that literally means warning. You rush, you clock in, you clock out. You count the days till the weekend, till the vacation, till the retirement. Always looking forward, never being present. That's the design. Because a man who is always chasing the future will never reclaim his now. And now is where power lives. The technocrats knew this. That's why the invention of the mechanical clock in the 14th century wasn't just innovation, it was dominion. Monks began using bells to regulate prayer. Factories used them to regulate labor, and before long, time stopped being sacred. It became currency. Spend your time. Save your time. Time is money. Double quotes. No. Time is you, your breath, your blood, your awareness, your one wild existence. But now, you're a commodity, measured in hours, judged by output, punished for stillness. Even your healing is on the clock. You ask, how long until I'm fixed? How fast can I level up? How soon will I become powerful? But here's the forbidden truth. Transformation isn't fast. Power doesn't rush. The soul doesn't wear a watch. And the men of Osowiec? They had no time left, no future, no plan. So they became something beyond time. They walked like ghosts, spoke with no tongue, fought without hope. Because they remembered, when all time is stripped from you, the only thing that remains is who you really are. And what are you without the clock? Not a machine, not a number, not an employee, but a force. Now ask yourself, are you living your life by your own rhythm, or are you dancing to a drum that was never yours? You were never initiated. You were aged, graded, graduated, but never forged. You grew older, but you were never truly transformed. And that was by design, because initiation, real initiation, doesn't happen in a classroom. It doesn't hand you a certificate. It doesn't pat you on the back. It destroys you, breaks you open, strips you down, burns away the boy, so the man can rise. Every ancient culture had it. The hunt, the vision quest, the warrior trial, the descent into darkness. You bled, you fasted, you faced fear. You met death, in symbol or in truth, not to traumatize, but to awaken. Because a man who has never suffered meaningfully will always be controlled by his comfort. That's the crisis now. We have too many grown males and not enough initiated men. Men with muscle but no mission. Men with degrees but no depth. Men with money but no memory of who they really are. Because without initiation, you remain fragmented. Your instincts stay buried. Your pain never becomes power. Your shadows never become sovereignty. You become easily offended, easily distracted, easily manipulated, because you never faced the fire. And they wanted it that way, because an uninitiated man is predictable. He chases validation. He avoids confrontation. He bows to trends. He fears being alone. But a man who has crossed the threshold, he becomes unshakable, not because he's perfect, but because he knows what he survived. He has met his own death, symbolic or real, and lived to tell the story. That's what Osowiec was. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a ritual, a mass initiation into a state beyond fear. Those men were coughing blood, spitting up lungs, covered in rot. And still they walked. Because at that point, they had nothing left to protect, only something to embody. They weren't just dying, they were crossing over, and in doing so, they became the myth. Now the question becomes, where was your fire? What moment broke you open? What descent forced you to rise? If it hasn't come yet, it will. Life always delivers the invitation, but you must choose, numb it, or answer it, because only through the forge can you reclaim your name as man, not as society defines him, but as eternity does. Power doesn't come from domination. It comes from sacrifice. This is the secret they stole. The truth they inverted. Because if you knew that everything they gained was built on what they gave up, you'd stop chasing influence and start building capacity. The modern man is taught that power is taking, that strength is in conquest, that dominance is the game, and submission is for the weak. But it's a lie. A toxic mimicry of something older, purer, and more dangerous. In every ancient tradition, the most powerful man was not the one who ruled, but the one who offered, the king who bled for his people, the priest who fasted in the cave, the warrior who walked into the abyss with nothing but honor. Because power that is not earned through sacrifice becomes decay. Look at the elite. They understand this law. They don't ignore it. They exploit it. They sacrifice too, but not themselves. They sacrifice you, your time, your attention, your children, your land, your blood. And they do it behind closed doors, in rituals you'll never witness, in temples made of capital and control, because they know sacrifice fuels the altar, and the altar must always be fed. The ancient empires did it with slaves. The modern empire does it with distraction. But you feel the pull, don't you? You feel that something inside you needs to die before anything true can be born. That's not weakness. That's the call to become dangerous in the right way, not by taking more, but by being willing to lose what's false, your ego, your comfort, your excuses, your cheap validation. That's the fire that made the dead men walk. They had already sacrificed everything. So when the order came to charge while coughing up blood, there was no hesitation. They weren't protecting life. They were completing it, because some deaths are not endings. They are culminations. And when a man walks with that kind of sacrifice in his bones, he becomes untouchable. You can't bribe him. You can't shame him. You can't scare him. He doesn't need the world to approve of him, because he's already died to the lie. Now, ask yourself, what are you still clinging to that's keeping you weak? What haven't you sacrificed that's holding your power hostage? You will not rise until something in you is burned clean. That is the way. That is the law. The world doesn't just mock masculinity. It fears it. Not the loud kind, not the insecure performance, not the aggression born from wounding, but the real kind, the sacred masculine, The kind that walks into a burning room and makes it still. The kind that speaks few words, but shifts the room when it does. The kind that doesn't need to dominate, because it already owns itself. That kind of man. The system cannot survive him, because sacred masculinity doesn't submit to lies. It doesn't kneel to comfort. It doesn't apologize for its presence, and most of all, it doesn't ask permission to exist. That's why you were taught from the beginning to fear your own strength. You were told to tone it down, to be nicer, to be safer, to be less angry, less loud, less sure, less you, because if they could make you ashamed of your own fire, they wouldn't have to put it out. You'd do it yourself. And that's what happened to generations of men. Weakened by soft culture, castrated by shame, mocked by media, and praised only when they became obedient caricatures of themselves. But something is shifting, you feel it. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. The return of the initiated man is underway. Not the tyrant, not the boy in a man's body, but the one who remembers the fire and has mastered it, because sacred masculinity isn't chaos, it's order forged in fire. It protects, it destroys, it builds, it blesses. It stands still while the world trembles and says, this far, no further. And here's what they never expected, that the isolation, the shame, the war against manhood would backfire. Would become the very thing that forged a new breed of men who felt the void and chose to face it, alone, trembling, screaming, but still walking. And those men? They're no longer waiting to be understood. They are assembling, quietly, deliberately, globally. Not in parliaments, not in protests, but in brotherhoods, in temples of the soul, in fire-lit conversations no algorithm can track. They are rebuilding the pillar. And when that pillar rises, the machine will tremble, because it was never built to withstand men who had nothing to prove and nothing left to fear. The sacred masculine does not come to beg. It comes to balance, to restore, to burn away the rot and plant what must rise next. And you are not late. You are right on time. You've already died, not physically, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Somewhere back there, a version of you collapsed. Under pressure, under betrayal, under silence, and something else stood up in its place. Not healed, not whole, but awake. That awakening, that was your revenant moment. A revenant, not a ghost, not a zombie, but a man who died and came back different. A man who carries death inside him, not as a curse, but as clarity. And if you've made it this far through this descent, you know exactly what I mean. You walk through this world now with new eyes. You don't chase meaning. You recognize it. You don't flinch from shadows. You've learned to mind them. You don't need validation. You move like a man who already heard the only voice that ever mattered, his own. Rising from the ash. This is what the system could never prepare for. A man who has nothing to lose, because he's already lost what was false. A man who doesn't fear being forgotten, because his very existence is a revolt. This is what the Osowiec soldiers embodied. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were men stripped of everything, choked by gas, drenched in blood, and yet, still they walked. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because something ancient had taken over. Something beyond survival, beyond self. They had become myth. And now you stand at that threshold. This is no longer about stories. This is about stance. The way you walk into rooms, the silence you carry, the presence that makes other men question everything they thought they knew. Because when you live as if you've already died, you become dangerous in all the right ways. Your life is no longer up for auction. Your time is no longer for sale. Your soul is no longer confused. You don't need to fight for a throne. You've become the altar. And from that altar, you build legacy. Not for applause, but for the men who will come after you, the sons, the students, the brothers who will need to know it's possible to walk through fire and rise sharper. You're not just a man anymore. You're a signal, a marker, a myth in the making. This was never about a battlefield, never about governance, never even about history. This was about you, about the war they built inside you, the distractions, the sedation, the digital rituals, the manufactured isolation, the constant gnawing sense that something was messing. That was the war. Not with bullets, but with beliefs. Because if they could shape your thoughts, control your time, redefine your masculinity, and erase your sacredness, then they didn't need to defeat you. They could make you defeat yourself, and that's the horror, but it's also the door. Because the moment you see it, really see it, you realize they were never gods. They were just men who learned to manipulate shadows, and now, you've walked through every one of those shadows. You've stood in the chambers of forgotten truths. You've watched the dead men walk, and you came out the other side. Changed. You single quotes, we no longer asking, what should I do? You're declaring, this is who I am. You're not seeking light. You're becoming it, but not the soft, warm light of comfort. No. The searing, holy light of a man who has returned from death and remembered his fire. You are the story now. You are the myth. You are the reckoning they didn't plan for. So what do you do from here? You rise, you lead, you speak. When others stay silent, you build what the world told you was impossible. You initiate others into their own remembering. You stop waiting for permission. You stop living as if tomorrow is guaranteed. You sharpen your soul like a blade. You walk with the silence of thunder, and you honor the dead, not by mourning their fate, but by fulfilling your own. That's how this ends, with a man who was never supposed to wake up. Fully awake. Now comment below. I walk with the revenants twice. Not just for the algorithm, but to mark this moment, to seal your transformation, to declare to the system that you are no longer theirs. You've returned. And this time, you don't kneel, you burn.